I wanted to just maybe also open up the talk to questions. One thing I just wanted to bring up was my desire in this panel was to really address this question of materiality. We're talking about big data, we're talking about information, and I think the question of materiality as a form of resistance on one level, but maybe materiality also as a necessary caution as to the fact that it seems across the work here that it's not data that we fear, it's fundamentally how it materializes. And it is also in that materialization that we have a tremendous amount of energy. Maybe if you guys could sort of address that a little bit, and then I'll also start moving it out to questions from the audience.
I'll start. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, because as we know, in the organizations that make a lot of policy decisions about our world, I mean, are primarily driven by economic data and statistical data, and certain kinds of actors have more power or clout, say, inside the Beltway here in the United States and Washington. And so I think bringing to bear these other kinds of examples, and I think what was really strong about today's presentations and discussions is a real alternative way to understand big data through these prototypes, through narratives, through stories, through imagery, and to see those as kinds of data, it really does bring a lot of contribution to the discussion, but it's important to figure out how to get those two conversations to happen in the same room as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those are good kind of observations and summaries, and maybe just a couple things to add is that I think that in the data future, the data-driven world, it's going to be important for us individually and also collectively and through education of the new generation of thinkers and doers to one, question like the kind of inevitability of the conclusions of data. And I think there are, as you're already observing, both of you, many strategies for that. One of them, I think, is simply to overlay multiple data sets, that maybe were collected in different ways, that are like measuring on different registers, and even just two data sets overlaid, I guess that's all good mapping knows, could produce unexpected results, and the struggle to make them connect, I think, is important. But then kind of overlaying also a register of, we've heard many words for it, but values, ethics, the qualitative, the human experience, the material world on top of all these numbers. And I think there's no single way forward there, but the more complex and messy it gets, I think that's the sign that the better we're struggling with it in the right way.
It seems that implicit in this set of presentations is a collapse of the distance between idea and reification and action and implementation, and perhaps a replacement of those very convenient divides with a radical oscillation and a rapid kind of model of design iteration, which seems to beg a set of emerging terms of reference and perhaps a renewal of some language, so that those dynamic and emergent and near living processes, if I can use those words, start to become ones that we can navigate. It strikes me that there's still an assumption that Plato rules us, that there is an absolute body of potential idea and analysis that exists before and above our work as architects. And I just find it tremendously tantalizing to have the chance now to start to work in a way that tests that, and instead to be able to move into a state of full-blooded involvement. Certainly that's attached to the availability of tools, to the ubiquity of tools, and perhaps through the increasing use of language which can grasp dynamic systems and impacts. I wonder about using performative language. It's a popular term, but it's a very potent term. It seems to me as a way of moving beyond the kind of transcendental world of ideas that prefigure action. Is it possible to work practically, to judge things by their results? I mean, an immediate apprehension, a fear that I have in saying that is that we become amoral or irresponsible. And yet, it seems to me that there can be a highly involved set of ethics that come into play in working this way. And it would seem that to me that seems like a reasonable thing to say, judging by the work that has been floated in the room, in which I think every single presentation has been involved in ethics.
Some questions from the audience? One over here first. Go ahead.
So big data is a lot of things, and one of the things that I think is really important is the fact that it's always changing, and its role in society, or the impact of big data on society is very much the impact of society struggling to adjust, to handle the onslaught of the fire hose, or that's the term around just coming in. And I'm really struck by how you've chosen to materialize data in the most static of forms, which is that we can build it. And so I'm wondering if any of you have worked with materializing data in a more non-static or moving way, and whether you think that it's important for architecture to focus on that as well as the impact of sort of using data to create new static forms.
I mean, from my perspective, one of the things that I do teach my students in their work in ethnographic observation is that a lot of things that they observe, or their experiences or their reflections, can be considered as data for the purposes of their projects, and I think for the purpose of advancing research and policy. And I think that really changes what counts as data. So if you're thinking about your reflections on your actual experiences in a public space or with an interactive urban screen, then I think all of those things, I think students aren't taught enough that can be data. I mean, not in a thin way, but that can really be valued, and that can really be brought into a real contribution in research. And so that's one of the ways in which I think we can change the conversation.
I mean, I think it's a good question, but not a simple one. And just my brief thought is that my interest in general, kind of in my research and practice, is the way that buildings and the wider built environment might come to life. Sometimes in response to big data, sometimes in response to other forces. But I think I'm super interested in questioning the kind of static and inert and kind of permanent and inevitable status of buildings. But also, I think, not all the time, everywhere, questioning those, right? Like, the static building is an important actor in the play of the drama of what we're going to do with data. So, I don't think your question is necessarily implying that, but I don't think in order to engage big data, everything is now in place.
Well, I like the question, and I'll declare my own project as also one which is pretty dedicated to this emerging sense of trying to create life, however fraught. that term and that claim might be. And I think that we can enjoy the sense that it's not a new project to create dynamic language in dynamic forms. I mean, certainly, since Marx said all that is solid melts into the air, we can see a full-blooded world of 120 to 20 years or so working, or else we can see like the project of a Shinto pavilion as having been rebuilt for 2,000 years or 1,500 years, every 20 years, as being a wonderful example. And yet, at the same time as that being a long-standing project, I do think that we can say that things have accelerated in the last 20 years or so with the achievement of the Genome Project and with the parallel achievements of ubiquitous computing and integration. It seems to me that might change things and not necessarily just result in an acceleration where we can finally replace Vitruvius, with something dynamic and contemporary, like hating the monument, hating this outmoded idea of architecture. I mean, if that's kind of an implication. It's very tempting, actually, to suggest that with the achievement of integrated flux and the ability to navigate dynamics, with the achievement of that language, it even more poignantly and more acutely raises the possibility of resistance, of durability, of closure, and of mortality as qualities which can be tremendously potent and urgent. And maybe a way to visualize that might be an inversion in which a tensegrity net exists. That is to say, a whole field of tensile force shedding, but many local contractile static acts of resistance floating within it that can act to renew, let's say, and irritate and push against the field as kind of local acts of substance and renewal. So that suggests that rather than looking at a revolution of trying to achieve a kind of dynamism, that an ambivalence, an oscillation might be, in fact, a really useful term, not in the sense of a lack of commitment or an uncertainty, but in the sense of moving into a greater sense of resilience.
Following up of that, I was quite taken with the idea of these dynamically informed systems, particularly in the physical world, being tied to other parameters that are, say, virtual. And one stark difference between the development of virtual networks and populations in virtual networks is that 90% of logs, and I'm making that figure up, are no longer updated. They're no longer being fed into the subsequent feeds that might inform some dynamic system or visualization or crystallization would go dead. And so I'm interested in your take on the idea that in constructing these dynamic objects or these objects that have a referent or a counterpart in the virtual space, do these physical indentations have a duty to expire? Or do they have alternately a duty to persist or hide from us or self-preserve? So I'd be interested in what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, in the case of the project that I showed where there's silicon trying to compete with the loss of silicon, it started with the idea of kind of competing forces of growth and decay, not just how do we make a three-dimensional data visualization. So the short answer is yes.
One more question, and I think then we're going to have to close up.
So I was listening and I respond specifically to David and Philip I was struck by your reference of Thomas Aquinas, and I thought of the definition of God as that than which nothing greater than you can see, which I think can be attributed to him. And then looking at David's discussion about the form, in 5 points, as soon as you get to 10 floors, it's beyond our comprehension, even any of our tools for comprehension, which of course results in this idea that there is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. See what I mean? And so I'm kind of struck by this idea of like inventing, that we're almost inventing, having discarded God out there, we're sort of almost like inventing this new belief structure, which either results in discussions around the ethics, as you can point out, or requires us to sort of invent rationales for selecting from our 10 bajillion possibilities. And so you kind of like end up with this system that forces us either to believe in the all-knowing, all-seeing data cloud that we'll never reach, or that forces us to believe that there's nothing out there and actually have to sort of invent every little bit. And I was just wondering whether you have sort of comments on how, if we are going to invent every little bit as we go along, how do we actually create the sort of the almost like the aesthetics in a non-kind of formal way, aesthetic structure for making those decisions, for deciding what to do.
Well, just a quick thought is, I think we need more people who are like, like you. That's the short answer. But I mean, meaning, and like a lot of, the presenters, the people who are interested in this issue, and most of the people in this room, who want to be quantitative as well as, to use Laura's terms, there are many other terms for it, but to be able to go back and forth, to be able to integrate, just like hypothesize about new ways to combine them. And all of my examples so far, to me, have seemed incredibly inadequate to deal with this back and forth, but just like the most basic of ignorant sketches about how that could happen. But maybe it's a fitting way to bring us back to education, because I think probably, although most of us are interested in that combination, probably few of us were trained in that double way. Or if you were trained in that double way, you probably had 2 separate paths, and you yourself had to figure it out. There's no program that I know that's deliberately trying to merge those and experiment with new models, and maybe that's a good direction, but it's a great observation.
Well, I'm quite provoked by the question, and I'll respond with 3 speculations. Although I will say that your question seems tremendously friendly, but horrific in its dualism. I mean, that we either cast ourselves adrift and are absolutely irresponsible, because the world is forming around us, or else we have to have total control and presume to be at the pinnacle, like part of the Enlightenment project. And well, yes, we're either with us or with the terrorists, aren't we? The project of generating multiple thresholds as a way of navigating complex fields is a really tantalizing one to my mind, and in responding, it makes me think of 3 disciplines. Anyway, one would be the sense, perhaps from biology, of starting to see things in terms of expanded physiologies, rather than only figure-ground relationships. I mean, if we look accurately at the action of an amoeba, for example, we see a hormonal figure, a prefiguration, a kind of a fate mapping of injecting an exchange in the milieu immediately outside that skin, which raises the question of being pulled by the surrounding matrix, as well as that little being moving around in quasi-intentionally, and we become able to navigate such an expanded physiology with the kind of sensor technology. It seems to me, and the increasing ability to work with fluid and viscous multiple systems. Secondly, from psychology, it's very tempting to look at the conceptions of partial objects from a preceding generation like Lacan, or a little later generation of transitional objects from Donald Winnicott. And again, to look at not simply our domain and the expansion of our domain with tools and the kind of I, thou clarity where we're very concerned about our own boundaries and good fences and of civic responsibility, that kind of humanist picture. And it seems like there's a tremendous contribution that can be made by looking at the formation of objects that comes alongside the formation of the infant psyche, in which a Banky or a little pup, you know, or the thing that I suck is a very curious kind of extension of a body, and perhaps an intermediate with the maternal body as well, and the kind of composites that can be navigated in that kind of view of identity become really tantalizing, and perhaps give access to a very sensitive domain in which there are multiple identities inside it, each physiology, and then very tempting to start to look at the composites and collective identities as well, as a terrain, you know, as a terrain to be navigated. And then finally, perhaps on a material level, very tantalizing to look from robotics at the organization of subsumption networks, rather than polarizing things into mainframe top-down or emergent Arduino cool open source crowd, you know, swarm of insects. Subsumption organization would say that there are multiple nested loops in which this bundle of ganglia with its reflexes, which results in action before it gets to my brain, or this one, or the pineal, produces a very, very interesting kind of resilient set of organizations which can readily map into an architecture of interactive systems, and which imply perhaps an expanded anatomy of many different interdependent nodes, which is not the kind of radicalized version that we had when we had the rhizome as just a deliberately decentered, arborescent tree hating kind of critique, but rather a nuanced, participatory, multiply scaled kind of network with many different kinds of impacts within them.
Yeah, I think actually your example of the amoeba is particularly apt, because in a sense the figure-ground relationship breaks down in the amoeba, because the inside and the outside can never be removed from each other. And that's actually why and perhaps you intended this, I'm not sure, but in the diagrams you were showing as you're speaking, I actually took everything you said as an analogy rather than actually thinking about physical volume or enclosure or anything like that. I don't know if that was intended.
Good, sure.
I have one other quick observation along those lines, because I think it's a really good question that we'll all keep pondering. But along those lines, and related to the amoeba, maybe, I've learned a lot from working with synthetic biologists and computer scientists recently, and it seems like a strange source for an observation about how to navigate this. But just really quickly, they are facing the problem of the incredible and unknowable complexity of cellular interactions and molecular interactions. But nevertheless, just like the genome projects have taught us, there's incredible advances in the technology, our ability to know more, gather more data about this kind of stuff, this interaction at this tiny scale. And the question is, can we, or when will we be able to encapsulate all of this knowledge in some kind of software, basically? So to know enough to make some predictions, some simulations, and gather potentially the same certainty that we have about the structure of concrete or steel. And surprisingly to me, the answer was not, we're on this quest, we're like 30% there. The answer wasn't a kind of a metric. The answer was, for now we have coarse models. And I think that's a nice term for it, and it's a nice moment of that science because it forces you to admit the inadequacy and incompleteness of our encapsulated data. And therefore, you, by definition, need something else on top of it. Now, what is that, and what's going to be the future, and how do people make better biofuels that are going to save the planet from climate change through that? That's unknown, but the framework is pretty nice at the moment. It forces computation to be one of many players in our understanding. And so I think that could be actually not just a step in an inevitable progression toward more and more refined models, but a good moment to kind of linger in.
Great. So I'd like to thank Laura, David, and Philip. And this sort of brings us to a conclusion. I'd like to thank you all for sticking it out. I think we have a reception next outside. So please join us outside for further conversations. Thank you.